Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are based today. My name is Frank Biermann of Utrecht University, and I have the special pleasure to welcome you all today for this semi-plenary of this year's Earth System Governance Conference in Bratislava. Today, we are presenting a new, and I believe a very exciting initiative of the Earth System Governance Project, the Taskforce on Climate Governance. This task force has been initiated and conceptualized over the last months by a group of ESG scholars, members of the Earth System Governance research community. The task force has been accepted by the Scientific Steering Committee of the Earth System Governance Project as a new initiative of the community, and it has been launched today. In this semi-plenary, we will lay out the ambition of the task force, its structures, and some of the leading questions that we are seeking to address with this initiative. The three panelists that you see here on the slide are the three co-conveners of this task force who brought this all together over the last month. And we will share this presentation, so with me starting, and then followed by Kyla Tienhara and Jacques Okereke. Before, I would just briefly introduce my co-conveners and also the co-panelists of this session today, which is Kyla Tienhara, who will speak after me, who is the Canada Research Chair in Economy and Environment at Queen's University in Canada. Jacques Okereke, who is a professor and the director of the Center for Climate and Development at Alex Ekwueme Federal University, Ndufu-Alike in Nigeria. And myself, Frank Biermann, I'm a professor at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. So we will run through this presentation and introduce into the challenging ideas we want to develop here in this task force on climate governance of the Earth System Governance Project. But first, the scope of the challenge that we see ourselves in with this task force. Number one, it is of course known to this community that the threat of climate disruption, climate emergency, people talk about climate breakdown, and also not on a threat, but even a reality of climate disruption, is surely one of the defining political and societal challenges of our time. And I believe it is really one of the most important challenges of this century, surely more important than COVID-19 and many of the other issues that we find on the first pages of the newspapers. There is hope. The IPCC and many other scientific studies have shown that under certain conditions and with heroic assumptions, humankind can still limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So there is hope. But the transformation challenge that our societies are facing is huge. There must be fundamental structural changes in the economic, societal systems we have and in the political systems. And the time window for political action is becoming narrower every year. We have 10, 20 years in which we have to reform and transform the systems in which we are living today. And this is a huge challenge. And that makes climate policy, effective climate policy, but also just climate policy extremely crucial. It is a political challenge for those of us who are in the trenches as activists in civil society and political systems, in many other areas where people are really trying to implement just and effective climate policies. But it is also an important research challenge. A research challenge for the natural scientists, but also and increasingly so, I would argue, for the social sciences, and here in particular for the governance research community. And here in particular, I would argue for the Earth System Governance research community that is coming together here in these days in this hybrid conference in Bratislava. And for all of these reasons, we have got together a couple of months ago to take the initiative to develop a new activity of the Earth System Governance Project, which is the Earth System Governance Task Force on Climate Governance. And this is something that we will present now, Kyla, Jacques, and myself, but this is also very much an invitation. So we have a few people who would really like to work on these topics, but we really would like all of you who are here listening to this talk, attending this conference, to join us and to work together with us to make this climate governance task force a reality and to explore together with us and all the other colleagues who are here on this call and in others, to work together and to advance the science, the social sciences of governance of climate change policies. So here, this is a challenge of the ESG Task Force on Climate Governance that we are laying out here. You might ask, why the Earth System Governance Project? Because there are so many other activities in the area of climate policy, climate research. Well, we believe that a task force on on climate governance in the Earth System Governance can help to galvanize the entire system, the entire community of the Earth System Governance Project to address this very, very important issue of climate governance. The Earth System Governance Project is probably today the largest social science network in this field. Hundreds of scholars from all over the world have come together. They are affiliated with this project as research fellows, as senior research fellows, as lead faculty members, as leaders of research centers affiliated with the community. And for those of you who are new here, for the first time listening in to such a call and such a conference, and you like what the Earth System Governance community is doing, you're very welcome to become a research fellow. It's a very straightforward process. You just have to send an email to the International Project Office with a very short statement of motivation, and then you become a fellow of the research of the Earth System Governance community and will be integrated in all the various activities that we are developing and that you also see here at this conference. And then the Earth System Governance Project can bring to the purpose of climate governance research its entire infrastructure that it has developed over the last 10, 15 years. A series of annual conferences, lots of other activities, workshops, communities, 3 book series that we have with MIT Press and Cambridge University Press. Since 2018, we have our own journal, the Earth System Governance Journal, and all this infrastructure, the bedrock of the Earth System Governance Project, we can bring to bear to study and advance the study of climate governance. And this is what we want to do. Of course, climate governance is not new to the Earth System Governance Project. In fact, climate governance has run through all the activities of the Earth System Governance Project since 2007. It was part of all the conferences, as well part of the first and also part of the second science plan. It has been addressed in so many panels and workshops and publications since the Earth System Governance Project was launched. But it was always fragmented. There was never an institutional focal point within the Earth System Governance Project that would just focus on the issue of climate governance research. And this is what we believe is urgently needed. The time is short to address the climate issue. We have not that much time left. We need to find better ways of governing our societies to address the climate challenge. And for this purpose, I think it's really time to bring together all the researchers in the Earth System Governance Project, to bring them together, those who work on climate issues in this climate governance task force, and to provide an institutional focal point for climate governance research in the ESG community. And this is why we have launched this task force. We launched it today, and it is an invitation for all those who are interested in climate governance to join us and to work with us and to jointly develop this climate task force and to really advance the science of climate governance as soon as possible. What could a task force do? Well, there are a variety of activities, and there are a variety of activities that we have done in many, many different ways and efforts in the Earth System Governance Project over the time. Of course, this task force could develop workshops and webinars focused on climate governance. We could think about joint publications. We have, as I mentioned, the Earth System Governance series with MIT Press, the Earth System Governance series with Cambridge University Press, the journal, and we could set a lot of agenda setting papers also in a variety of other leading journals. We could think about agenda setting papers that really advance the debate on climate governance by bringing together many colleagues from this community. One thing that has been always important for the Earth System Governance Project since the first years has been the strong involvement of early career researchers. And this climate governance task force can certainly also advance this involvement of early career researchers in this community and bring them together and give them a clear home within the Earth System Governance Project. The Earth System Governance Project is a home for early career researchers. The task force on climate governance can be a sub-home, so to speak, that brings together those who are working on climate governance as a particular subfield of Earth System governance. We could think about presentations at the annual ESG conferences, semi-plenaries such as today, joint panels, conference streams, and then also, of course, a dedicated event at the Taskforce days. For those who are not that involved in the Earth System Governance project so far, this Friday is the so-called Taskforce Day, where the task forces of the Earth System Governance project are coming together and are discussing their joint activities, new publications. So the Friday is in a way the working day where the people from these different activities, task force and working groups are coming together and are designing the new research agendas and writing papers together, co-author books and these kind of activities. So on this task force day, the Climate Governance Task Force could also contribute and organize very specific events for the particular purpose of researching climate governance. Of course, our community is not only about science, it's not an ivory tower community. What is very important and maybe most important is policy impact. And here again, a climate governance task force will bring together the knowledge of the entire community and try to galvanize it for focused global policy impact. And this is a big advantage of having such a large network. So it's not one person, it's not one scholar who says something in a paper or some presentation. It is a community of scholars that can act together and can write papers, assessments, where many, many parts of our research community come together. And we can speak with one voice, and this could increase and will increase our global policy impact. And we can rely here on the International Project Office of the Earth System Governance Project, its Science Communication Officer, James Butler, but also the entire community in a sense of social media channels that the Earth System Governance Project has developed over time. And all this can be at the surface of this Earth System Governance Task Force, and we can really try to make a big impact on global policy based on our research on climate governance. And one part of this can also be policy-driven assessments of very particular questions that we might find important or that are important, hot issues in the debate, on a conference or the party, in the processes under the Climate Convention, or any other events like in the IPCC. And all these activities, these policy streams, we can intervene at the right moment and bring together the scientific knowledge that we have generated over many, many years in the Climate Governance Task Force at some point, and bring it together and have, I believe, a form of policy impact that is different from individual scientists. It goes beyond individual scientists, but it brings together the community of Earth System Governance scholars to speak with maybe one voice and really bring together our knowledge in this field. So these are all activities that the Climate Governance Task Force could do. Climate Governance Task Force will, of course, cover many, many areas. And for that reason, we have to collaborate on the one hand. And that means that we will also collaborate with the different other task forces of the Earth System Governance Project. And there are many of them, and I list a couple of them. We have a task force on oceans, which is very, very active, a task force on biodiversity that is being set up currently for those who are interested in that field as well. And then we have a couple of more cross-cutting task forces on Earth system law, was just presented an hour ago, democracy. We have a task force on anticipatory governance. We have a task force on planetary justice that will work together on the task force day on Friday. We have a task force on sustainable development goals, again, with activities this Friday at the task force day. So there are a number of topical task forces, oceans, biodiversity, and climate will fit into this line. And then there are cross-cutting ones where our scholars of the Climate Governance Task Force will work together on the more specific issues of law, democracy, anticipatory governance, justice, the SDGs, and maybe some others as they are emerging. So this is the matrix structure of the Earth System Governance Project, and the Climate Governance Task Force will perfectly fit into this matrix. And we hope to really learn a lot also from the colleagues, and the insights in these task forces are listed on this slide. The topic is big, and therefore we expect to have so much interest in this community that it might make sense to organize the work in the Climate Governance Task Force in a variety of more specialized working groups. And this is similar to some of the other task forces. So you have a larger task force that brings together all the climate governance scholars. And in addition, you have smaller, much more focused working groups where particular research communities are coming together on joint publications, on joint planners, on joint papers, etc., etc. And there is a variety of ways to organize climate governance research. And we don't have the silver bullet, the final answer to how best to organize it. We got together and thought about 7 working groups that could be initial way of organizing the work of the Climate Governance Task Force on more specific issues, where we see a lot of support from the community, a lot of interest from our research fellows, also looking at the panels that we can observe here at this conference and the last conferences. So we believe that these 7 working groups bring together a certain critical mass for much more specific understanding and research on climate governance. Then the other considerations, of course, we don't want to have too many either. So you could also say, well, I mean, for example, trade investment, why don't you have one on trade and one on investment? We also believe that more than 7 is probably too many to bring for an organized and fruitful collaboration. So we thought about these 7 that we have on this slide could be a way forward how to organize a climate governance task force in the Earth system governance community. And we will run in these presentations today in the semi-plenary through these 7 working groups that we initially came up with. The one would be on the key challenge, in a way, of decarbonization. So how can we really organize decarbonization? How can we support and transform and change political systems, governance systems to achieve the decarbonization that we need in as shortest period as possible? So this would be a working group of those scholars who are particularly interested in these transition and transformation processes towards decarbonization. Then we would have a working group that is looking at this more recent debate in a way about carbon dioxide removal, the call about that, where there's a lot of interest and a lot of need for scientific research also from the policy communities that are discussing these issues today. We will think about a working group on trade, investment, and finance. We will talk about this also in a second. Climate justice will be very central for this activity as well, working together here also with the task force on planetary justice. So here, the justice community can learn from each other in a way. Non-state climate action is a big debate for many, many years. And we believe there's still a lot of research to be done. And we have a very strong research communities working on non-state climate action. I would like to galvanize this community and bring it together in one of the working groups at this climate governance task force. Climate transparency, accountability, and litigation is another area that is very prominent in our research communities. We also want to bring this forward in as a working group. And then also climate related to development and related to the SDGs is the 7th one. And we have slides for all of them in a bit more detail. And we're also very keen to listen to you and your views about where this makes sense and what other workings possible, or what are the key questions under these working groups. As I said, this is an initial set of 7 working groups. Other working groups are surely possible. We have actually also a list of other working groups that we could find, that we find also very interesting, but where we are not 100% sure that they will generate the same critical mass as what we expect for these 7 topics. So we would propose to start with the 7 topics and try to bring all the activities into this fold. But if there's a strong critical mass of scholars who want to work on another issue, it's absolutely possible, of course. This is a bottom-up initiative. The Earth System Governance Project has always been bottom-up. So if there's any community out there that wants to work on an 8th working group or sees a different cut, it's absolutely possible. We just change the setup immediately. So this is for the discussion after this session and also in the weeks and months to come. We are now running through these 7 working groups. So I start with 2 of them, and then Kyler and Jacques will take over to give their own view on the task force, but also introduce the other working groups that we have designed in a way, but we just put them on the table so that everybody can just jump in with questions and ideas on how best to organize these task force, these working groups, and what the key research questions could be for each of these 7 working groups. The outputs of such a working group are, of course, many options, and I kind of listed a little bit before, but each working group could be organized, especially initially maybe, around a high-profile paper in which the debate is assessed and pushed forward by many authors. We have experiences with these kind of papers where many members of the Earth System Governance Project are coming together and jointly write one paper that has quite often a strong impact, because so many scientists also are supporting a particular position and are supporting a particular scientific insight. Policy interventions could be organized by these working groups because they are so specific on their question that this is really landing to interventions into the policy process at the global level, but also at the national and local level, however it might fit. Webinars, of course, could be focused on the task force as today, but they can also focus on these working groups. So that is also then again one thing where the infrastructure of the Earth System Governance Project can help researchers to reach out and to reach a larger audience, because they can rely on the Earth System Governance International Project Office, they can rely on the social media accounts and many other parts of the infrastructure of the Earth System Governance Project, so that can help to maximize the impact of any webinar or any other activity that you might want to organize based on this, organized as a member or a leader of one of these working groups. Special issues, it's obvious, could be organized from these working groups, panels, workshops at conferences. It could be ESG conferences, next ESG conference, for example, but could also be other conferences, for example, of the International Studies Association, or many other events that are there. So here working groups could organize specialized sessions that bring their own research together. And the same is the case for side events. They could also be, of course, organized by a working group because they are so specialized for their unique issues. The coordinators, just an initial group of people that has shown a certain interest in putting this together, and they all have shared also drafts of the first outlines, discussed these working groups. So as co-conveners right now are myself, Chucks, and Kyla, who will present here. We have a very strong support by Milena Niesen, who is working with the IPO at Utrecht, and who has volunteered to coordinate this task force about the next year and bring together these activities. So she will be behind the email account of the task force that we are setting up. And then we have a couple of colleagues who have volunteered to lead or co-convene some of these working groups: Harald van Assel, Stephen Bernstein, Michelle Betzel, Sandra Chan, Peter Wern, Arti Gupta, Mers Hoffmann, Dhanasri Yaram, Prakash Kashwan, Louis Kotze, Kennedy Litim Weber, Marianne Gefeire, and also others. And others means in this case, anybody is invited, is very much invited to join this. So this is an initial group, people who have been with the Earth System Governance community for quite some time, who worked on the climate issue, climate governance, and they got together online over the last couple of months to set this all up, to start somewhere. But that means for all others, you're very much welcome to get involved. So what stands here is "and others" means you. To the extent that you work on climate governance, you're very much invited. Join this activity. Think about what is your interest, what are the most exciting research questions where you can contribute, and then please, you're very much welcome to join one of these working groups and to join this community of scholars to bring these activities forward. Just for the working groups that we have foreseen, as I mentioned, I will present two of them briefly, and then Kyla and Chucks will take over and present the others. So these are the 7 initial ones that we have thought of together with the colleagues who I have just listed there. And again, this is the first cut. Anything else is also possible. It's a bottom-up process where we are relying on your input, we are relying on your enthusiasm, and we want you to take part and co-create and co-design this activity. So number 1, I mean, it's not in any particular order, it's just that this happened to be the first slide on my presentation, is the issue of climate transparency and accountability, which is one of the hot issues in the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Huge transparency debate there. There's also a proliferation of non-state and private activities here, disclosure of climate activities, which is critically reviewed by many scholars. It's a huge impact on governance in general. There are also certain areas where there is not sufficient transparency. So all this entire debate about climate and transparency is one of the key issues in the climate debate, in the Paris Agreement, but therefore also for us as Earth System Governance researchers, and there's surely not enough work being done. And also, we would relate this to litigation, which is not exactly the same. It's a hot topic, as we all know, about climate and litigation with all these recent debates and also judgments by rulings by courts across the globe, which is in a sense a way of accountability. And we would like to bring this here together. We would like to combine here the work on transparency and accountability with the work on litigation and bring together here also the litigation work with the work that happens in parallel with the Earth System Law Task Force. So we believe that this is a set where a group of scholars can get together in very intense, fruitful, mutually useful discussions, publication projects to discuss these issues further. So here we have a few scholars who have agreed to convene this working group in the beginning, and this is, of course, as I mentioned, open for all of you to join. This is not a closed shop in no way, but the initiators are Harov and Asad, who has worked on these issues on climate law in particular for many, many years, Arti Gupta, who works for a long time on transparency and climate issues and other issues as well, and Louis Coetzee, who is, among many other things, he is also the co-convener of the Earth System Law Task Force. So he will kind of connect the two by being in this task force and this working group. And at the same time, he will also bring this work together with the parallel activities of the Earth System Law Task Force and ensure that all these activities are making sense. And Adi Gupta, I can add, also is a member of the Scientific Steering Committee of the Earth System Governance Project, and is also a link to that, as is Chucks, also who is a member of the Scientific Steering Committee, so that we're also represented at that level in a way. Another working group that we could kind of foresee as being important politically, scientifically interesting, and also where we believe there's a sufficient critical mass of scholars in the Earth System Governance community, would be something on carbon dioxide removal. It's widely discussed. It's maybe also necessary, critically discussed by many people. The governance, political implications are not really sufficiently understood. So it's a hot topic. It comes up in the debate increasingly so, but this is really, I believe, a case for the Earth System Governance Project to study these issues, to study the political implications, the governance implications, also from a critical perspective, from a justice perspective, linking here with the Planetary Justice Task Force, also critically with the perspective of the role of industry, of corporations in this debate on carbon dioxide removal. So we believe this could be a fascinating area for Earth System Governance scholars to work together and bring this particular debate forward and have a joint statement, a research agenda, but also eventually maybe a joint statement on the governance and political implications of carbon dioxide removal, whatever it is. I mean, there are, of course, many, many different approaches and technologies. It's a very complex field, but I believe, and my colleagues agree all together here, that this is an important area to be studied. And this would be initially led by Peter de Verne, who has worked on many of these issues for a long time, of industry, major corporations, and he was a keynote speaker at 2 years ago at the Earth System Governance Projects Conference, and Prakash Kashwan, who has also worked on these issues for a long time, also bringing here his work on his interest of climate justice. So Prakash will also link this then to other communities who are working on justice questions. And we have here also the first research fellows who have expressed their interest to join. And I believe that there are many more research fellows who are also very interested in working, expanding their research in this area of carbon dioxide removal research from a governance political perspective. We thought that we should not work explicitly in this area on solar geoengineering, which is sometimes being seen as being similar to carbon dioxide. I mean, carbon dioxide removal and solar geoengineering is totally different, but they're sometimes linked together as geoengineering, especially in the earlier years of the debate. And we would not necessarily work here and focus on governance or solar engineering, also because a number of Earth System Governance Project scholars have already come together to form another group that is looking extremely critical at solar geoengineering. And this is a different line of research that is already supported and developing in the research community. And I think it might be best to keep these two activities separate, but it is of course inherently also probably linked. And we have to see how this all plays out. And this is very much open to the community and open to all of you to join and to try to help us shape this research space and try to develop the leading research questions that we might want to develop here. So these were two working groups. And I would like now, first of all, to thank you for your attention. It's great to see so many people at this call. It's great to see the enthusiasm. I hope for many of you, I see that the chat is already overflowing with questions, which is fantastic. Again, this is an invitation. We do not have a master plan. We do not have a clear idea of how to organize this. We believe, and there we are very enthusiastic and very clear, we believe there's a huge need for climate governance research as a community within the Earth System Governance Network. We believe there's a case for an organized effort, an organized task force on climate governance. We have a couple of ideas about working groups, but how exactly we want to do this is very much up to the community, and we hope that many of you will join us and help us to think this all through and to develop the leading questions. I am leading over now to Kyla Tienhara, who will present another working groups and her own take on the need of climate governance, a task force, and then this will be followed directly by Chucks Okereke, who is then presenting other task working groups and his own takes. And by that, I'm stopping my slide. And thank you very much. And of course, all of us will be later available for questions and responding to all these points. Thank you so much. Kyla, over to you.
Yeah, okay, got my slides going, I think. So thanks so much, Frank, for that great introduction to the task force, and also for the invitation to co-convene it with you and Chucks. It's a real honor, and I'm really excited about it. Thank you also to the conference organizers for doing such a great job with everything, for all the technology that you've mastered, and also for not making me wake up ridiculously early in the morning for this presentation. I really appreciate that. So as Frank noted, I'm primarily here today to speak about some of the working groups and what they're focusing on and planning to do. But before I get to that, I just wanted to follow up on some of the things that Frank talked about, and also just explain why I wanted to be involved in this task force and why I'm excited about it. So it really comes down to two reasons. The first one is that I really love the ESG community. It's by far the most inclusive and pleasant academic group that I've ever come across. And I think it's one where people genuinely put their egos and their personal ambitions aside in order to create better collective outcomes. So I'm generally just sort of predisposed to wanting to collaborate with ESG scholars. And I've been drinking my coffee from my Mexico conference mug this morning, thinking fondly on the last time that I was with you all, and I hope we will all be together in the same room again sometime soon. The second reason is that Frank really emphasized to me, and I believe this also came through in his presentation today, that he really wants to have this group to have a policy impact. So I want to explain a bit as to why that's sort of particularly important to me. So first, I'm increasingly hearing activists shout things like listen to the science or do what the science requires at politicians and other people in power. And I sort of take that to mean listen to the physical climate science. So listen to the IPCC report that just came out calling for code red and all of that kind of urgent message that we need to do something very quickly. And of course, it's incredibly important for politicians and everyone to act with the urgency and the scope of ambition that the scientific community tells us is necessary. But climate scientists, as smart as they are, can't really tell us whether the best course of action is to put a price on carbon or to ban further oil exploration. They also can't tell us whether some policy interventions might be politically unsustainable because they are grossly inequitable. They can't respond to that how are we going to pay for it question that inevitably arises, and so on and so on. So yes, listen to the science, but also listen to the social science, and please not just the economists. We have lots of people listening to economists, and especially the orthodox economists who think 4 degrees of warming is optimal. I think we need to move away from that. I certainly welcome people listening more to ecological economists. So in short, I think that there is a lot that politicians and other people in power could learn from listening to the ESG community. So I'm most excited about what this task force can do to facilitate that. And I also think that the time is very ripe for our interventions in policy discussions. So I hope you'll forgive me for taking a slight divergence into Canadian politics here. Canada is where I'm from and where I'm currently living. And you may or may not be aware that we are currently having a federal election. So in a week and a half, we will be going to the polls. And for the first time ever, climate is actually the top concern of Canadian voters. It's not actually that difficult to explain if any of you have been following what's been happening here over the summer. So in July, the west coast of North America experienced an unprecedented heat wave, which is called a heat dome, which is a term I'd never heard before. Over 800 people died in a single week in British Columbia as a result, and previous temperature records for the country were shattered, with the village of Lytton, BC reaching 49.6 degrees Celsius. And then that same town burned to the ground. It was completely obliterated. And people from across the province were all of a sudden wearing masks, not just to protect themselves from COVID, but from wildfire smoke. So people here are finally waking up and realizing that the climate crisis is not just a crisis for future generations to deal with. And it's not something that we're going to be able to easily escape or adapt to simply because here in Canada, we're rich and we live in a relatively colder part of the world. Unfortunately, when it comes to translating this awakening of the Canadian public into actual political action that matters, we seem to get stuck. So we still get polls with garbage outcomes like this. I mean, you would think that we could have moved past this whole economy versus the environment debate by now and accepted that there is no economy without the environment, but apparently we're not there yet. And disturbingly, even though climate is the top of the list of voter concerns, we're actually facing the possibility of a government being elected that would weaken Canada's already unambitious Paris commitments and build even more pipelines to bring dirty tar sands oil to market. So to summarize, Canadians get the climate science. They get that things are bad and rapidly spiraling out of control, but they don't yet seem to get what needs to be done to avert the worst possible outcomes, or the fact that we could actually build a better and fairer society in the process of decarbonizing the economy. And this is where I think we, as a scholarly community, come in. And this is really an all hands on deck moment. So here in Canada, but really everywhere, I mean, don't get me started about the other petrostate that I get to vote in, Australia, and its whole gas-led recovery from the COVID economic crisis. I mean, it's just mind-blowing. So if you're looking to work with people that want to shake things up and do something with all of our collective knowledge, then I encourage you to please join us. I promise that action is the best cure for climate anxiety. And furthermore, let's face it, at the end of the day, none of our purely academic achievements are going to mean anything if the climate shoots past 2 degrees. Okay, so that's the pitch for you to come on board with us. Next, I'm going to delve into a bit more detail on what different people have already got planned. And again, just to repeat sort of what Frank was saying, I should make the caveat that we're just getting started and the working groups haven't even convened. So this is all preliminary and subject to change and evolution, as these things really always are. And again, that's a good thing because it means everyone in this audience and in the wider community has an opportunity to get involved at the outset and shape the working groups as we move forward and suggest additional ones. So first up is the Decarbonization Pathways Working Group. So this one's being spearheaded by Stephen Bernstein, Matt Hoffman. They're both at the University of Toronto, and then also Michelle Betzel and others. These scholars have been working on this critically important topic already for a long time, and I'm sure that most of you are familiar with their work on this. The key aspect for this group is that their research is really forward-looking and explores policy and political pathways toward decarbonization. They're interested in work at multiple scales and research that considers the interdependence of subsystems of carbon lock-in. So economic lock-in, technological lock-in, cultural lock-in, and political lock-in, which is important because I feel like we have all of those forms of lock-in currently working against us here in Canada. I would also note that, as is common for the ESG community, this group is open to different approaches and methodologies. For example, politics of decarbonization, socio-technical system transformation, transnational climate governance, and so forth. And finally, justice and equity in pathways is a key consideration for research in this group. I think, as you'll see as I go through, it's a key consideration for many of the groups, and also has a working group of its own. So I think this is a positive development, that obviously we've woken up to the fact that the climate governance is not possible really without addressing issues of justice and equity. Next is the Non-State Climate Action Working Group. This is led by Sander Chan, Haro Van Asselt, and Michelle Betzel, among others. Again, these are long-standing members of the ESG community, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with their work, but if not, look it up because they've been doing some really awesome stuff. I've also noticed there's been some quite a lot of incredible presentations at this conference on this sort of that would fit in this area. So I think this working group is going to have a lot of interest. So the group is conceiving of non-state actors quite broadly. So they'll work on businesses, investors, civil society organizations, cities and regions. All of that is welcome. They're interested in both how these non-state actors work with each other to achieve climate outcomes, and also on how they interact with state actors. Other key interests are how to strengthen non-state climate action in the Global South, and the relationship between non-state climate action and the SDGs. Again, this is an obvious area where the work of this working group overlaps with another working group that we have, as well as an entirely separate task force that focuses exclusively on the SDGs. We don't see these overlaps as a problem, and we of course welcome interaction and collaboration between the working groups and also between the task forces. I would also note that, especially because of all the discussion about adaptation in the chat, that although it's not explicitly mentioned in this slide, it's my understanding that this group would be looking at both what non-state climate action at both mitigation and in terms of adaptation. And I think that probably goes for a number of groups. So to some extent, it is a cross-cutting theme, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't also have a separate working group on adaptation. I think that that's a fairly good idea, and very open to discussing that further. And also, I just want to say that although I'm not really involved in this working group, I'm currently teaching a course at the moment on climate change in cities. And in my very non-expert opinion, there's a lot of climate action happening at this level. And I think that this working group is going to be really interesting and have a lot to contribute. So finally, I'm going to present on the Trade, Investment, and Finance Working Group. I am directly involved with organizing this one, along with Haro again, and also Kennedy Mabeva, who recently finished his PhD at the University of Melbourne, and I believe is starting a postdoc in a few months at Oxford. Congrats to Kennedy if you're out there in the audience. Some of the things that we are interested in exploring in this working group are climate clubs and the role that investment, trade, and finance measures can play in them. We're also very interested in equity and justice. Again, that's the sort of cross-cutting theme here. So things like are climate-related trade measures fair? So for example, right now there's a lot of talk about carbon border tax adjustments being put forward in the global north in places like the EU, and also under discussion in US and Canada, and the question of whether those are going to be unfair to countries in the global south. We're also interested, in addition to the global south, global north divide in terms of equity within countries, and with respect to the need for a just transition for those workers that are currently employed in high carbon sectors that need to be phased out. Just to take a quick example from my own work on investment treaties, I'm thinking a lot about the sort of double injustice that occurs when we in the global north tell countries in the global south that are new entrants to the oil and gas industry that they should leave their resources in the ground and not benefit economically from them. But also at the same time, we seem to ignore the fact that our governments are signing treaties with these countries that mean they will very likely be sued in international arbitration if they go and ban oil and gas extraction. Another area of interest that we have is regional trade agreements, both in terms of whether they can strengthen climate governance through the inclusion of specific provisions on climate. For example, I just saw in the news this morning that there's a bit of a conflict between the UK and Australia, and it seems like the UK has bowed to Australian pressure to drop any reference to specific climate targets in their trade agreement. So that's an example of where governments are trying to use trade agreements to strengthen climate governance. It's not always working. And then a question of also whether the inclusion of things like investor state dispute settlement weakens climate governance by allowing fossil fuel companies access to arbitration to challenge national climate measures. And then finally, we're interested in how all of these issues are playing out in the context of discussions about the reform of the World Trade Organization, as well as ongoing efforts to reform or even terminate investment treaties. For example, the Energy Charter Treaty is currently a focal point for this whole debate about climate governance versus investor rights. And just a little plug, I'm hoping also to hold a virtual workshop next spring as part of this working group's activities on export credit agencies and what is happening around the world with reforming these agencies to bring them into line with 1.5-degree objectives. So if there's anyone in the audience working on export credit or related areas that wants to be involved with this, please do reach out to me directly. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavor for what we're thinking about, even if it's all quite preliminary. And I do apologize, I spent more time on the last group than the other two, but obviously it's the easiest one for me to speak about. So now I'm going to turn things over to our last speaker, Chucks. I think he's sort of already been introduced as a professor of global climate and environmental governance at the Okwemi Federal University in Nigeria. He's also just a globally recognized leading scholar on climate governance. And I think it's particularly interesting to note that he's been doing some really important work this week advising government officials in Nigeria, which is exactly the kind of policy impact that we want people in this task force to have. And we're very grateful and very pleased that he was actually given permission to take a brief break from that in order to join us here today. So over to you, Chucks.
Can everyone hear me? Thank you very much, Kyla. Thank you so much, Frank. Thanks, everyone, colleagues, for coming. This is really appreciated. Let me add my voice to what is already a very comprehensive and, in my view, clearly laid out justification for this task force. Now, if you look on my screen, you will see some pictures. I want to make clear that these are not artistic impressions. These are real life pictures capturing real life events, all in Nigeria. In recent days, the devastating flooding in the West, in Spain and Germany, but also in the US, has been extensively covered by global media. And suddenly words like loss and damage, which had become, which we are sort of previously regarded as taboo words, were used increasingly by the political leaders in the developed country, and conveyed also in some of the actions that they took and in the global media. But many of us in the developing world have been experiencing the reality of climate catastrophe, the disruption of daily activities and livelihood for many, many years. Many of us have been calling attention to the devastating impact of climate change in our economy, but we have received very limited attention. And I feel that the impact of climate change on the economy of developing countries continues to be deeply underappreciated. And so I am very sympathetic to the chart that Kyla was responding to, which is already pushing us to strongly consider adaptation as a standalone working group. And we do know, many of us here, that the challenge with climate change is no longer the science. When the IPCC started, or when the issue of climate change first made it to the public discourse, the central question was about the science of climate change. I would argue that after years and years of IPCC work and other excellent works that are being done by other review communities and universities, we have to accept that the issue of science is settled. It's unequivocal that climate change is happening and that it's having huge impact around the world. As Frank said, this is now judged as one of the central challenges facing humanity. Interestingly, Frank was talking about the threat of climate catastrophe or disruption, but actually, as I have shown, this is already happening. It's not the threat of it. We are living. Many, many poor countries are already living. So the question is not about science. And I will also argue that the question is no longer about technology. We have the right technological tools to manage this problem. The price of batteries, storage, and other major technologies to address the problem have been falling dramatically over the last 10 years. And the question also is not money, if you ask me. A few years ago, some of us would have been minded to debate me on this, but I hope that what has happened with the COVID situation convinces many of us now that the question is not really, it's not money, I said. The developed countries managed to find within a space of 11 months, nearly $10 trillion, which they threw at COVID. And maybe rightly so, because it was in their face. And the same analogy can be made with respect to the flooding events, which I've already referred to, where suddenly money was found to relocate people and address the issues of loss and damage that have been faced by the industrialized country. If the question is not science, and it's not technology, and it's not money, it leaves us with the view that the question is really about how to organize the money, how to organize the technology to be able to address the problem. As Kyla and Frank beautifully articulated, the fundamental challenge we have is about how to transform the system in order to be able to address the challenge. And once we articulate it in this way, it seems to me that it becomes really obvious that it is the issue of governance. It's about how to mobilize the investment, from who and where and when, what kind of infrastructure should we be funding, how do we use the infrastructure that we are funding to deal a blow on the issue of inequity. Given a deep understanding we have that infrastructure can be one of the key ways to narrow the bridge between the rich and the poor. What kind of institutions shall we be constructing? Who should have a say in the way those institutions are constructed and formed? What kind of incentives should we give? And to who should we give those incentives in order to ensure that we achieve this transformation? How can we ensure that the incentives that we are giving is equitable? what kind of ways can we drive innovation? Somebody has told me that, well, this is just about technology. And I reminded the guy that the technology is deeply ingrained in institutions, and is also an issue of equity and justice, insofar as the expertise for technology resides much more in certain people and communities and countries than others. So these are some of the challenges that I live with on a daily reality. Kyla has just talked about the fact that I am in a hotel room, if you look behind me, training Nigerian government officials on how we could approach COP26. But I'm not having it easy at all, because while there are some strong elements in the room in the government that really want us to go fast, some have continued to refer to this op-ed that was published by the Vice President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria last week, referring to what he called the divestment delusion. In this op-ed, he argued that it was very unfair and unjust that developing countries like Nigeria are being placed on what he described as a carbon embargo, that they should not mine their resources. He was very angry in that paper and talking about the fact that a lot of people in the West are still using gas to cook and to heat their homes. And already these same people that are using gas to cook have placed an embargo on Africa, and that they cannot, the government, I mean, cannot find money to fund the oil and gas extraction. He was particularly emphasizing gas and saying that the embargo or the ban on gas exploration is a death blow to African economic growth. And so the issue is governance. And then I know that, of course, I'm preaching to the converted here. And one of the other things that I don't think when you look at the writings on governance that African countries particularly have received the kind of support from these sympathetic ESG community to which we belong. And so the research that we did when I was full-time at Reading not long ago showed that a lot of the publications on climate governance in Africa is still done on behalf of African countries by our sympathetic friends in the West. A huge percentage of that, 60%, is published by Western countries. And even the remaining 40%, a huge amount of it is just in South Africa. Perhaps I think probably Harold Winkler, if he's here, and his colleagues in Cape Town are doing most of it. And then you see 3% in Kenya. And then you have many African countries, for example, where we couldn't find any substantial amount of research on climate governance. So there is a huge gap in knowledge, climate governance, both globally and I think particularly in Africa. And so one of my selfish reasons for answering this call from Frank to co-lead or co-convene is that I'm hoping that we can mobilize the brain, the zeal, enthusiasm in the ESG community to help to develop research on climate governance, as well as also help to influence policy in this regard. And so we have two key working groups that I'm sort of very much involved in. The first is climate justice. Many of us here are very sympathetic to the issue and have published quite a lot. Prakash Kawan, Frank, and many others. We wrote a paper on planetary boundaries and justice recently, but there are many of us here, Diana Lieberman and co, who have really pioneered and championed work in this space. We will focus this working group on the complex and contentious, but also increasingly evolving links between climate change and justice. And someone, I think Marco Billy, was asking whether the focus of the emphasis for work will be on the global or whether it will be across the scale. And the answer is definitely the latter. It has to be across the scale. We will cover issues of justice from the international perspective, from the global perspective, from the regional perspective, and we also do from the local community perspective. There are, of course, issues about intergenerational equity and intragenerational equity, issues of interspecies justice, justice in the context of adaptation, justice in the context of gender. There are no boundaries. This working group will have the liberty to develop the specific work, their emphasis on how, where they want to focus, depending on the interests of those that will join, and maybe even sometimes be opportunistic to be able to capture the moment and be able to do work that will influence policy and practice. And the second one is the issue of climate development and SDGs. As Frank said, there are already a very vibrant task force that is clearly connected with this, but we still see a space for more work on the link between climate change, development, and the SDGs. Diana will know that in the IPCC circle, some people continue to misunderstand this. There are some people who think that the SDGs is the same thing as development. Other people think that the issue of development is only for the poor countries, and that we should, in the context of developed country, be using the word transformation rather than development. These, in my view, are problematic assumptions and positions that, if you ask me, cannot be evidenced in literature. Because if you look at the SDGs, for example, the issue of overconsumption, for example, is a major issue. But also inequality, even within developed country, for me, is also something that is problematic. And as Kyla was saying, if you're really interested in development, you cannot divorce that from investment and trade. There are some people that argue that African countries, for every $1 they receive, they give away about $11. There are some that have shown that the total amount of money freighted away from Africa through illicit trade and through sort of legal compensation for the multinational companies, if you put them together, they are up to 11% more than the official development assistance that Africa receives. So there are strong basis to question the current economic structure of the global institution and how that fuels underdevelopment in Africa, and the role that climate change may play in either exacerbating, but also perhaps narrowing that gap. For example, the issue of the race to carbon zero, carbon neutral world, which many of us who are climate enthusiasts will support. But if that is translated in an uncritical way to say that every small community has to be carbon neutral by 2050 at the same time, you can immediately see how these can already do damage to the development aspiration of African countries and many other developed parts of the world, which is part of the point that the Vice President of Nigeria was making. Maineka Vajat, Dhanashree Jerem, Prakash Kawan, Frank and myself and others will be interested. And Maineka, for example, has said that I need to convey the fact that one of her passions is about Sdg coherence. The unstated assumption in the SDGs is that all of them will be, we are equally committed to all of them and we can all achieve all of them together. So the idea to leave no one behind, but also to ensure that we carry everybody along is a major tenet of the SDG. Yet we see in practice that there could be some conflict in the implementation of the SDGs, either in terms of horizontal or vertical. So there could be conflict in terms of how the emphasis on greening may be problematic in terms of addressing the issue of zero hunger or no poverty. And we could also see how emphasis on water preservation could have impact on the issue of agriculture. and many other examples can be found. So there are there's a lot of scope for developing, in my view, innovative work, high-level works that can impact policy and practice in the area of SDG. And so, again, just to say that the issue of COVID has hit Africa really hard. Some people say, well, many people have not died in Africa. Yes, somehow, by a stroke of luck, by God factor, call it whatever you want. Africa has managed somehow to escape the sort of devastating number of deaths we're seeing in other parts of the world. But the social economic impact is deep, devastating, and potentially long-lasting. We are now in an era where from nearly 5% GDP annual increase that Africa was enjoying overall, we've now fallen into deep poverty and in some cases recession. 5% inflation, fall in remittances, and between 25 to 30 million job losses. And so as the world is mobilizing these trillions, 1.9 trillion in the US, 299 billion in the UK, and all this money is swooshing around the places, it is important to be a reminder that Africa needs significantly more money injected and more support in order to be able to recover from COVID. Some people say to build back better. In Africa, it will be to even build something, because 70% of African infrastructure is not yet built. So there are, and we need to do that in a way, of course, that is sensitive to the issue of climate change. So the nexus between climate and COVID is something that is crucial. And actually, I think we have a semi-plenary going on right about now addressing this. In conclusion, I want to re-echo the appeal that Kyla and Frank have made for you guys to join us. We have some great ideas, as Frank and Kyla have articulated, but it is still for all of us to come together and make this task force what we want it to be. We have our email group, but I think it is now to open up for conversation. So thanks very much, and I look forward to a vibrant and dynamic conversation that can help to sharpen our ideas on the direction of travel. Thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you, Chucks, Frank and Kyla, for that introduction to the Task Force on Climate Governance. Very exciting, of course, and thank you all who are involved in these working groups in this hugely important initiative that's forming. I am Gustav Tungren. I'm the Managing Director of the Earth System Governance Project Office, and I will be helping with the moderation for the questions that have come in. And I am streaming here live from Bratislava, and it's fantastic to see so many people from the community once again. And there has been a lot of questions, there has been a lot of activity in the chat, and I just wanted to first touch upon a question from Christopher Leon, who's posted in the chat. And he's wondering whether there will be some type of synthesis mechanism, or whether there will be a group to draw out the insights from all the other working groups to and posits that this will be useful to avoid silos. And Frank or Kyla, would you have anything to say to Christopher in regards to this? Perhaps Frank.
Well, I can start. I mean, it's a very, very good question. I mean, once you start dividing a community in working groups and subunits, then the question of fragmentation is a very, very important one. Siloization is an important threat. And I believe we will definitely have mechanisms to bring it all together. So right now we try to build this all up. And once we have functioning working groups that are really working on these issues, then we will develop mechanisms to bring it all together. This will depending on the scale of intervention. We could bring together all the working groups in joint publications. We can bring them together in joint presentations, panels, workshops, streams. So we have to see how it evolves. We have to see how strong the working groups will develop, but we will certainly work together and bring them all together. And this will be one of the key points of attention. This is also why, I mean, Chuck's, Kyla, and myself will also be in different working groups so that we can also make these interlinkages and bring it also together. So, and as we could see in the chat already, many colleagues have already pointed out to the cross-cutting issues. I mean, that runs through these working groups or that maybe require different cuts. So it's certainly everything is related, but we have to start somewhere. So it's a very good comment, and this will be really one of the most important issues in our agenda to ensure the integration of this task force and its integration with the other Earth System Governance task force that we also have. It's a huge matrix. It's a lot of fun, and we will work on the integration. Thanks for the comment.
Okay, thank you, Frank. Kyla, did you have anything to add, or you were?
I just wanted to note that while we don't have a meeting of the task force at this conference, because we're just getting started and we didn't want to rush it, we definitely will at the next conference, and that'll be a great opportunity for all of the working groups to interact and exchange information. The one issue I have is that I know that a lot of people in this task force will also be in other task force. So I think that's something that the conference organizers are going to have to think about is how do we avoid people having to choose between which task force to go to. So that's something to consider. But otherwise, I think what Frank says, it's definitely very important, as well as the interaction between the different task force.
Thank you. And of course, in the chat and in the Q&A section, there's been a lot of suggestions for possible working groups as well. I figured it has been discussed across Kyla's and Chuck's presentation partly, but I was thinking in terms of this adaptation, many have raised this in the questions, and I just wondered if perhaps one of you would like to address adaptation as a topic of a working group a bit further. I think, Frank, you might have not had the opportunity yet to address this.
Me? Yeah, I mean, adaptation is, it has been discussed by our group before. So it was one of the issues that we thought about, whether it makes sense to bring it together in a task force. We don't have a working group. We don't have a working group on mitigation. So we were kind of thinking that was more along the lines of a cross-cutting issue, where, for example, trade investment addresses both mitigation and adaptation to some extent. But on the other hand, it's fully correct, of course. We have a huge community of scholars in the Earth System Governance project who specialize in adaptation governance. And we have actually quite a few of publications on that. I mean, a book on adaptation and Earth System Governance has just been published by Cambridge University Press. So it is a large community, and we could think about bringing it in, this is certainly a possibility if scholars are interested and feel motivated to rather see an adaptation and climate adaptation working group. This is certainly something we could organize. I mean, if there's a critical mass, everything is possible. It's a way of how we cut it all, and we don't get too many working groups at the same time. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Frank. And I will jump ahead to another suggestion that has come in. This is from Asim Sia, who suggests that a working group on climate diplomacy that could be cross-cutting in its focus on mitigation and also adaptation, as well as for broader cooperation issue, and adding that it could also focus on the policy architecture emerging from the UNFCCC. And maybe Chuck's, maybe I'll throw this question to you. How would you see the inclusion of a working group on climate diplomacy?
Thanks, Gustav, and thanks for that suggestion. Just like the issue of adaptation, the issue of climate diplomacy was also discussed exhaustively in the group. One of the I talked about my excitement in joining to lead the ESG, but the pain I have had so far is having to make the choice of those 7 working groups, because there is a substantial argument that can be mounted for a range of other working groups. But as Frank, I have to just start somewhere. I, for one, would not be opposed to have a working group along the lines that have been suggested, if again there is critical mass and enthusiasm. So that's my view. But I also think that there's quite a lot that can be said about climate institutions and diplomacy and politics in the context of the existing working group. So it's just about how you dice it. But we are not pushing for a restrictive number of working groups. Of course, there has to be some way of managing the numbers, but we want to have a vibrant intellectual community and activity in all of this space. So if the number is there and the appetite is there, why not?
Thank you, Chucks. And maybe we'll follow suit on the topic of suggested working groups. And of course, as you state, you seek vibrancy and you seek people to come to you with suggestions as well. And one of those suggestions is from Marisela de la Torre Castro, who wonders more about the topic and challenge of ecosystem damage and biodiversity loss. And Kyla, maybe I will ask you to respond to this question.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I, for a very long time, actually didn't want to do much scholarship on climate just because I felt like it was overwhelming all the other issues that are so critical, and biodiversity is one of those. I think that, and Frank can jump in here if he wants, but I think that because there is a task force on biodiversity, the best thing is probably for it to get up and going. And then for us maybe to have some kind of joint session at some point where we can discuss what the best way forward for how to deal with those interactions between climate and biodiversity would be, whether it would be good to have a joint working group that works between the two task forces, or if there's some other way to go about it. But definitely we're aware that that's like a critical linkage. Frank, did you want to add anything to that, or?
That was really already the next question.
Okay, so let's move on to the next question. So, of course, I can also see this being quite an interest in many participants that want to partake. We will have a networking session where everyone will be able to speak to each other after this session. So we do invite you to join at that if you do want to talk more about this in person with, I think Frank and Kyla will join us there. As for, of course, the interest is not only in chat, and it's also in the Q&A, and I note that conference chair Tatiana Kluvanakova is wondering about also adaptation and mitigation as cross-cutting themes. I think we have talked a little bit about this at this stage, but also that she's particularly interested in the working group on decarbonization. And I think I will try to move on to more of a practical question. We will get to your question later, Matthew, but Ina Muller is just asking how the activities of the working groups will be organized, and how will you call for a meeting, and how does one sign up? And I think whoever wants to answer this question, Frank, you have your microphone on, so perhaps you will take.
I can just start. I mean, this is a question for all three of us, but I mean, we will have an infrastructure. That means, when first of all, for the time being, I mean, we have a networking session thereafter. So Kyla and I will be there. Chucks has to talk to important decision makers in Nigeria. So Kyla and I will be there. We're very happy to network and discuss this issue. That's number one. That's for today. Then afterwards, we will have an email account. Chucks has put it on the slide also already, but we can also post this later. For the time being, you can also email all three of us together, and then we kind of develop this further, get back to you, and then we see, I mean, if we get lots of emails for a particular issue, then we turn this into a working group or put the question out. So we will find a way to that. We will have our own Twitter handle. We have already a website for this working group that is under the Earth System Governance website. That is, right now, it's a bit static still because we just started right now. but it will grow over time. And then in technical terms, we will be as part of the Earth System Governance Community, we will meet at the conferences. And that's normally how it developed over the last many years. There's the Earth System Governance Conference somewhere on the planet. And then there's a special day, which is a day for task forces. And there are also other activities. So you can also have, of course, during this conference, other ways of working together. You can meet for many days if you want to. So we will have these kind of events at the conference. And in between, we will get together virtually. I mean, we are very experienced with virtual meeting these days. So then we will find ways of working together. And then the working groups themselves will organize their own activities, of course. And then we will find ways to bring it all together. But for those who just asked a very basic question, number one, how can I join? Very simple, send an email to either us three or to the email address that Chuck had put on his slide, or to IPO, which is Gustav and his team. So send to any of these emails and send it, and then we will kind of put you on the list and we'll move forward. Second question that nobody has asked, but you might ask is, do you have to be a research fellow of the Earth System Governance? Of course not. This is an open community. Anybody can join. We don't have cards and cents. Just join us. It's very easy. So anybody can join this activity. And especially also with ideas. You can join just like that, but you can also join with a very particular research interest, a very particular idea, and say, I would like to have this topic and want to invest all the time. Though, of course, I mean, for all comments, for people who support an idea of a working group, that means also we assume that you also want to be involved. So it's it's not useful for us to have that this is a working that could be done. So it would be also, of course, important that people immediately volunteer to be part of this working group and to organize meetings.
Thank you, Frank. And I see that of course, we have a long question from Matthew Patterson, and Chucks, I see you typing away here in the chat, and I'm wondering if perhaps you want to address this in person. So Matt is raising two aspects that he, or two question with two aspects, and the first one being the architecture of as we frame it in Earth System Governance. So in regards to climate governance, how it exists, how climate governance, the architecture interacts and what it all adds up to. And the second theme being power and politics. And I think Chuck's, he's addressing you in this question, so I will hand it over to you.
But I think it's probably better to speak. Matt is right. That is exactly what I was trying to get at. Perhaps not as articulately as I probably could have. But the issue, for me, the whole question about how do you transform or change the current global structure in order to achieve sustainability or low carbon future is the issue of politics and power. And this is exactly what I was talking about in many of the things I referenced, but in fact that the flooding events in Nigeria and Africa as a whole have received very limited attention compared to what is happening in the West. That is only when the West began to suffer from these sorts of events that the language of loss and damage have begun to creep in more forcefully into the vocabulary of the political, those in power. The fact that Africa is being sucked out a lot of money in terms of the legitimate profit of the MNCs, as well as illicit financial flow, of which are more than 11% of what Africa receives. We've been using gas for many decades, and now an embargo has been placed on Africa, and we are not able to find money to utilize our gas reserves. It's an issue of politics and power. Everything I said is just about power. I think the central thesis I made is that it's not about science, it's not about technology, it's not about money, and that is about governance. And governance is an issue of power and politics. And so the issue of what kind of governance structures could work in order to shift the globe, but also even at national level, the society to low carbon future is a central question. In Nigeria, for example, that is the issue we are facing. We have limited money. The NDC has been costed for 177 billion to implement. Where do you get the money? Who is going to pay? What kind of arrangements will be used to disperse the money? So at the national level, it's also about politics and power. And this is why the issue of coherence is very, very significant. So yeah, Matt, I cannot wait to have you as part of the working group, bringing your energy and your intellectual sharpness into what we're trying to do. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chucks. And Kyla and Frank, do you have anything you wish to add to Chuck's response?
Yeah, it's all about power in Canada too. So completely agree with everything that Chuck said. Maybe we should have a working group on incumbent industry power and things like that. But yeah, definitely. And just thanks to everyone for the great discussion questions. And I hope to see a lot of people over at the networking. Thanks.
Okay, so I think we have a last question, and I think this will be the very last thing we do before we transition over to the networking session. And once again, this is from Ina Muller. And she wonders, what do the organizers think of the idea to aim for a collective report on climate governance, similar to the report of the IPCC, but purely social sciences? And frames this as a one-stop shop for policymakers. So perhaps I can have a response from you, Frank, or you, Carl.
Well, I mean, the IPCC is of course mandated by governments. This kind of, it's an intergovernmental activity, and we are not, and we don't want to, of course. I mean, this kind of, we are just plainly a bottom-up scientific a network of scientists, of scholars. On the other hand, I mean, I'm a big fan of larger assessments of social sciences. I mentioned it a bit in my early intervention, that I believe that the social sciences can have a louder voice if they speak together. I mean, of course, social scientists always disagree. That's part of our discipline to some extent. On the other hand, if we really try very hard and listen very closely to what we are saying, as a community, I think there are some messages that are non-trivial and that we can bring forward as a community. We have done this on the Sustainable Development Goals. So we have brought together 60 scholars who all did research on the Sustainable Development Goals. And these 60 scholars, well, actually a little bit more than 60, they assessed one simple question: what are the political impacts of the SDGs since 2015? And these 60 scholars together have brought together the entire knowledge. We have reviewed 3,000 scientific studies on this particular question. And this is forthcoming as a book with Cambridge University Press in March. And this is kind of an assessment. It's a bit on the IPCC model to some extent, where the chapters have lead authors, convening lead authors, and contributing authors. It has been organized over 1 year of time. And so it is a bit following the model. Governments have, of course, totally been not involved in a way. So we just brought it together, and we have a concluding chapter, which is then even more focused on this particular question, whether the SDGs make sense. And I can imagine that similar activities could also be done on the climate governance issue. That could be on the working groups. Even if I look at these working groups, it can be on sub-questions of these working groups. It doesn't have to be a book with Cambridge University Press. It can be an article in Nature Climate Change or any of the other outlets. They're very interested in these kind of articles where 20, 30, 40 authors get together and say, this is what we know on a particular governance question. And that, I think, could be a great way. And this is also puts us ahead. And it's also one of the rationales for being together in the Earth System Governance Project, where we can join forces and bring all our individual findings and insights together in joint assessment. So I think that is certainly, it's not the IPCC, that's not what we are doing, but it's a bit in the same direction of speaking with one voice, collecting findings globally from the Earth System Governance community. I think it's a very powerful opportunity, and I think we can do this. And this is what one of the reasons why we have set up this Climate Governance Task Force.